Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Practically Platonic. Hi, Sylvia.
Hey there.
So in this episode, we're going to talk about our allotted daimon. So this is chapter 3-4. So the word daimon is often misinterpreted in the modern day as meaning demon or something demonic, inherently evil. But the Greek word goes back to antiquity. And the daimon, or daimons rather, are actually the entities that act as intermediaries between the divine and the human world, or the material world. And so we have the old story where Diotima explains to Socrates, the priestess Diotima talks to Socrates and explains that the gods and the goddesses don't actually directly interact with our world, but rather there has to be an intermediary. So you have a class of spirit, or I guess you could say, sub-god, that is called a daimon, and they work between the divine and the human world. And everybody, according to this framework, also has a daimon assigned to them, actually before they're born, and which sort of oversees them throughout the course of their lifetime. And so this chapter by Plotinus discusses the daimon that is allotted to us. Some people can also understand this as spirit, or as even a guardian angel. I think the concept of the guardian angel actually originally comes from this Platonic idea of the allotted daimon. So Plotinus in this chapter goes into a lot of detail about reincarnation, metempsychosis, because this was a belief that Plato professed, and at least amongst many philosophers in the Hellenistic world, they believed in reincarnation, so that after the present lifetime, you'll have a future lifetime. And very similar to Buddhism, the way that Plotinus describes reincarnation, he speaks of the possibility of being reborn not just as a human, but also as an animal or into some other incarnation. And it's the quality of our actions and how we orient ourselves in the present lifetime that directs our souls into future incarnations. And in this chapter, he talks about the world soul, which of course is technically undescended. And then there is the personal souls that which are us, that are descended. And it's the sort of orientations we take in life, how we orient to ourselves, that will direct our future lifetime. So if you are orienting yourself towards vice and material concerns, then you can end up being reincarnated as an animal or as a bird. But then there's also the option here too of orienting yourself toward the divine, in which case that you might be able to actually ascend into the intelligible realm after death. And even in the present lifetime too, your soul might not actually be fixed or tied to your bodily form, and you can actually orient yourself, ascend yourself into the intelligible realm. So there's a lot of content here, and I think it's very interesting to compare it to Buddhism. Sylvia, what do you think?
I think that this concept is him trying to use Plato. I don't think he's able to close his argument. I think it's a valid idea of discussing the concept of free will versus determinism. But I think there's aspects as we talk about this, as we go through this brief chapter, in which I think his logic based on things he said previously either are not very well explained, or he doesn't seem to close his argument very well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get there when we get there.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about different activities that the soul has while we're alive, such as the very basic animal activities that we all have to do to meet our basic needs, the emotional activities we may take a part of, which can either rule us or we can have control over, and then the intellectual activities that a person can choose to focus on. And I think these different activities that we can perform during our life are aspects that will then influence the results of our next life and what daimon we end up with in the life after that, if we have another life. And he speaks about having a daimon assigned to us right in this life, and then when we pass on, he speaks of another daimon. Is your understanding that these are two separate entities, and there is another entity of, I guess, a different level depending on where we end up, consequent to the way we lived our previous life, or is it the same daimon?
No, it's a separate one.
Okay.
My reading of the chapter suggests that, for example, if you're going to find yourself reincarnated as an animal, coming down from a human, then the daimon will be a much cruder, simpler daimon, rather than being something a bit more elevated towards reason and higher faculties.
But do you know from your other readings, or what you know of this concept in antiquity in the West, did daimons kind of function much like angels later in Christianity, where they have, I guess, no free will, in the sense that they are always going to be in the state they are because they're immortal, versus humans who have, at least in humanist Christianity, have the unique position of being this malleable being that can either, become a much better person, or can lower themselves to almost a subhuman level. But we have free will to choose what kind of person we want to be.
Right. So a daimon, it would seem, based on what I remember from Iamblichus, does not have free will in the same sense that a human does, because they're basically direct servants to the divine.
Got it.
That being said, we could speculate that maybe some of them go rogue and do their own thing, but there's not just your allotted daimon, there's also daimons that oversee the material world as well, and basically exercise the will of the gods in the material world. They're basically like the engineers or the technicians of creation on the ground, so to speak, if I can use that sort of figurative imagery. And so they are also, the allotted daimons are also able to provide a sort of moral compass. And I think this goes back to Socrates having that sort of moral compass, that whispering in his ear. And so in this case too, it's not that the daimon is simply watching you, but it's also directing you. It's not creating the world that's ahead of you, but rather it's sort of offering, or even actively directing you in one direction or another.
So when you say directing, do you mean that you have no free will, or that it's, I guess, is it recommending things, or is it actually direct commanding you to do certain things without your conscious knowledge?
I guess you could conceive of it more as sort of like a push rather than a command.
So an influencing factor.
An influencing factor, yeah.
Okay. Because I think that's important to differentiate, because it can make this a very different metaphysical landscape one way or the other. One would be very deterministic, and the other one has room for free will.
Well, you see, that's the thing here, is that so when you are going into your next lifetime, the daimon is assigned to you even before you're born, and then there's this sort of process of direction that unfolds ahead of you. Now, in your lifetime, you can sort of follow along with the sort of fated reality that's been set out for you, but then that could lead toward more or less mundane circumstances, and also just a life without a lot of free will, a life without wisdom. But then on the other hand, you do have the option to pursue wisdom, in which case you start to divest yourself, I think, from what has been allotted to you, and then you can actually orient yourself back toward the divine. What that means is that material reality is to a large extent fated, and the circumstances you find yourself in are outside of your control, whether that be the family you're born into, the weather you encounter, even your internal physiology as well. To a large extent, a lot of this is fated. But despite all of that too, you can either go along with it and just more or less live without any sort of sense of curiosity or even challenge, and in which case then you just basically live according to fate in material reality, and then your life will just unfold in that way. On the other hand, if you start orienting yourself away from matter and divesting yourself away from vice and all the things that make us attached to material reality, then you're basically orienting yourself back to the divine, in which case it's away from this sort of fated material reality, in which case then, because you become increasingly free from vice, you'll also have greater access to wisdom and greater understanding of the nature of the soul, and why it's also in your best interest to divest yourself from matter. That's my understanding of this. And then the daimon, it seems, can also take a stand back from this, in which case then your faculty of reason and your sort of connection with the intelligible realm and the divine sort of takes over, in which case the daimon just basically operates on standby, I think, at that point.
I guess it would, as you say, quote unquote stand back in the moment in which you start to behave in such a manner that is above and beyond the expectation, the moral, I don't know what to call it, the spiritual level of that specific daemon, right? Perhaps you come into this world as, I don't know, a person that is allotted to be fairly mediocre intellectually and spiritually. As you move forward in your life, you make choices that turn you inward so that you orient yourself more toward the soul and become someone who starts to see aspects of your soul more than the noise of the external material world. And so you start becoming maybe more wise and more ethical and just a better person than what would have been expected based on what was allotted to you. So at this point, you've kind of perhaps hypothetically eclipsed, like the student eclipsing the master. And if the daemon is to some degree sort of like a guide in life, but again, it's a guide based on what the expectation, you're like the minimal requirements expected of you in the next life is, right? The moment you start to truly exceed that, I guess in that sense, he kind of steps back because he is no longer in a place where he can meet you because you've exceed. And as you've already said, most likely they don't have the level of free will or malleability that we do. They're kind of stuck at whatever level they're at least these allotted daemons. What allows this to happen is that, going back to everything else he said, right, is the turning inward toward the true self, which is the soul, versus being on this little set track, like you're on a ride at a theme park and just looking out at the illusory set that's been set up for you. You're turning inward and realizing the reality of things, and therefore you're able to remove yourself from the track and make other choices. I think this, so to kind of tie it to what I'm reading right now, which is not ancient text, I've been kind of reading different existentially influenced psychologists and sociologists from the early to mid 1900s, particularly Erich Fromm, but also some other thinkers who were influenced by Heidegger. And one of the main, and to stick to Fromm, but some of these other people kind of touch upon it too. One of the main things that they keep on talking about, and they're talking mainly about what they see as an insanity or a malaise in contemporary society of their time, than the 1930s, 40s, 50s. But I think it's applicable now and was probably applicable before that. It's these structures that are put into place, which is society, and the belief that the human needs to adjust to society and that makes you sane. But really, this alienates you because you're no longer yourself. You give all of your life power to this external thing, whereas someone who seeks sanity, he thinks, goes through a period of neuroses or a period of, of turmoil to truly turn inward. And this idea of finding the true self, or as Heidegger's term, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, the sign, the true being of man, which is this being in the moment always and being the true self. It's a problem that man has always had. How do we really escape our circumstances or our fate, be that the powerlessness that we feel even when confronted by the society we live, the people around us, the malaise that we see? We could just very easily fall into that. And I think we see that a lot of people have fallen into the structures of modern society, even our contemporary society, into depression, lethargy, a powerlessness when it comes to their politics, their society, their very health. But I think once someone chooses to turn inward and truly start questioning who they are, independent of all these external illusions, you are able to tap into that vitality, which is the vitality of the true soul. That's it. I really enjoy when I see truths that have been repeated in time from different perspectives by different thinkers.
Well, I mean, to give a sort of simile, so if you have a glass of water and you put metal filings in it, the water is technically still water. The water is still pure. It's just that for a temporary period of time, it's contaminated with the metal filings. And you can filter out those metal filings, but fundamentally, the task at hand in a lot of philosophical and religious traditions is to basically get back to that pure state. Now, people have different ideas about how to do that. But I think if you live in modern day society, first of all, within a secular materialist society, which is the default worldview of the West, regardless of what, people might say, but what is taught in the education system, what is endorsed by the government, is a secular materialist worldview. And so what that means is that there's no soul, but rather you just have a brain, and somewhere in there is consciousness, right?
We are basically a thing.
We're basically a thing. And in the standard materialist scientific worldview, you're basically just a brain. And even today, there's people, scientists, suggesting that free will is an illusion, in which case everybody is running on autopilot, and the sort of sense that we have of free will is just an illusion. But I mean, even setting aside those sort of philosophical problems, I think at a very deep level, when you no longer have a worldview that looks towards the possibility that you could purify your soul, and that this has a sort of greater significance than just being happy, but rather there's a sort of multi-life process, or there's basically a transformation that you're working toward in the post-mortem state or in the afterlife. Without all of this, I think it becomes very easy to basically just sort of just basically enmesh yourself in mundane material concerns, right, and seek happiness.
I think that was exactly the point that people like Fromm were making. The fact that God is dead in contemporary modern society since the Industrial Revolution, and also later Enlightenment, since there is no God, the thing that has taken its place has been a re-centralization of man outside of any sort of divine will or divine fortune. All that exists is capital. All that exists is materiality. And therefore, man himself has become the creator of all this material, but also has now become the subjugated by his own material. He now is treated as a thing. Even our worth in society is how well adjusted we are to be able to carry out functions within the society that only can have a use while we're alive as material things. People's use is no one cares so much about, even like the idea of ethics. People only really care about things like that insofar as it may create instability in the structure of society, which is only really tied toward creating more and more wealth, power, or materialist gain, or the perception of materialist gain, or creating, I guess, ways to distract and escape the other malaise that people seem to have because there is no other meaning. Society is filled with things we can escape with. All of the medias that we use, all of the things that we often are tricked into believing we care about, but that fundamentally have no bearing beyond the now in this material world. So,
but it's also in modern day society as well. We also have the freedom to pursue happiness. But then,
what are we being told happiness truly is?
But you see, that's the problem, is that this pursuit of happiness actually goes back to Greek ideas of eudaimonia, the good life. But in the 20th century, I believe it seems to have gotten warped into a very different concept, which is basically where suffering or anxiety or adversity or interpersonal conflicts in which people feel upset are all treated as anomalies rather than part of the portfolio of experiences in life. Where in other cultures, for example, I'll give you an example. One of my Japanese friends said, you Westerners always talk about being happy. You can't be happy all the time. And I realized that in the Japanese language, if you translate the word happiness into Japanese, it actually just sort of means like delighted or joy. But this concept of happiness in the West, where it's like you're content, you're free from anxiety, you have, constant, consistent, happy personal relationships.
They're not free from anxiety. They have a constant anxiety that they're constantly trying to cover.
Right.
And I think that state of anxiety is really our body, our soul telling us there's something wrong with the way that humans are living. And sorry, but I don't think that the Japanese are absolved from this. I think they just have chosen to live with a level of apathy and suffering in the name of production as well. They need to stay in line.
No, I agree. But I'm saying that they just don't articulate things in terms of like the pursuit of happiness.
the way their
They,
society has decided to handle this issue is different.
you're more likely to hear people talk about duty. So if you
Yes.
ask people, well, why are you toiling away at a job that you really, really hate and that is causing you all these health problems, and you have the next 30 years to get through before you can maybe have a retirement? And when I lived in Japan, the response to that was like, oh, well, it can't be helped. It's just duty. We just have to do what we have to do. And so you carry forth that way. And then in the West, though, a lot of people will make very drastic life decisions in the pursuit of happiness. They might quit a job. They might end a marriage. They might even abandon their children. They might drastically, do a makeover over themselves, try to reinvent themselves in some drastic way. But I think in many cases, this is all done because it's all oriented toward a sort of material world, or also
Sometimes.
and also social perceptions as well, and social validation. And I mean, there is so many problems, and I mean, there's a mental health epidemic, particularly in the West, that seems to be just getting worse and worse and worse.
There's a mental health epidemic in the East as well. Don't tell me that there isn't one in Japan. Go look at the figures of people actually having children, happy marriages, and the levels of suicide. I think that both cultures, so going back to what you said, where people make very strong changes to their life in the West, I think often they're still misguided, but I think there are people who are genuinely trying to change. There's also a difference between I don't know that much about the East, so I can't say much about the Far East at all. And I don't know how much influencing factors there were once contact with the West was made, insofar as psychoanalysis and stuff. But I think a lot of what you're talking about is definitely the influence of German psychoanalysis and the whole history of psychology that has developed in the West, on how people are at least somewhat aware that there's something quite wrong. They often rationalize it to themselves, or find very vapid ways of dealing with it. I think most people don't really deal with it at all. I do actually have optimism, though. I think people are starting to change, just based on what I'm reading about how things were not everybody, but I think those who want to change, I don't know, I feel like we're in a very divided time. There's some people that are almost way worse off than the things I'm reading about from the 50s and 60s. And then there's other people who clearly are moving in the right direction, at least in the West. I can't really speak for and I'm assuming the East as well, because we now live in a very globalized world. So people who are unhappy with whatever kind of society they're in will try to have a much wider net of information they can go to, at least to start contemplating things.
But I mean, going back to the point you made, so the West is very much influenced by Western psychology of like Jung and Freud and these sort of thinkers, whereas in Japan, it's not that they don't have these influences, but they're relatively new to this culture. Right. So they're more likely to be influenced by Buddhist thinking. And Buddhist thinking, at least especially at the layman's level, is that, well, there's a lot of suffering in life and you're just going to have to get through it as best you can, because that's just the nature of life. So, I mean, the average person there is coming from a very different sort of cultural makeup than
right. Absolutely,
born and raised, particularly in like either the English or like German-speaking world. When it comes to expectations of how you're supposed to behave.
Yeah, it's totally off topic of what we're talking about, and not one where I'm expecting an answer. Even though if anybody knows, please drop a comment. I would be curious to know what modern philosophical movements or specific people, or even in the study of human behavior, if anything markedly came out of Japan after World War II, after the trauma of the atomic bomb, because obviously it had a deep lasting effect on that country. And I say that because psychoanalysis and all of that, and even like a certain German existentialism and French existentialism really and Western thought really was deeply influenced by World War I, and especially the atrocities of World War II. The Western trauma and the ways of thinking about things came out of that. So I'm kind of curious what came out of World War II. I don't know how much the Sino-Japanese wars may have affected people. I know that was definitely a period of change too, because of Westernization and such, but certainly something as traumatic as World War II must have brought thinkers and how they developed.
I mean, I'm
Yeah.
I'm sure there's vast literature in
Yeah.
Japanese explaining the sort of psychological effects of the atomic bombings and the loss in World War II, the loss of lives, the surrender.
Right. I just mean like how that then changed all of society, and it kind of changed the way people lived. And therefore,
Yeah.
I don't have to explain what I'm trying to say. The kind of like isolation and alienation that happened in the West, and the kind of realization that horror can still happen, and how the West reacted in this kind of godless and materialistic world. Clearly, Japan after World War II is a very different place than it was before World War II or World War I. And I guess not so much a study of what happened to them, what happened to people specifically because of the atomic bomb, but an interest in studying people and their pathos in general moving forward in society. Do you see what I mean? Because these events changed how people were, and therefore it also changes the direction of thinkers and what they pay attention to. But going back to diamonds, I'm sorry, I really took us kind of off track there. But I guess, yes, it's all about like being able to, psychology and different ways of thinking. It's all about being able to take control of your life and truly try to find out who you truly are deeply, what the soul is, and change your circumstances. So I said I was going to bring up what I thought was problematic in his idea. And I may be misremembering, but I think that to some degree in previous chapters, he said that when we were talking about evil, probably that all evil things that are done, or like bad behaviors or immoral actions by humans, are really done by the passions of the material body, of the material, that the soul, even the descended soul, when it's no longer, is not really tainted by this. But if that is so, then once it's separated from the body, I would think that it remains pure and has no baggage from the previous life. But if that were so, then why are these souls then directed to different lives consequent of the life they previously lived? I don't think he does a great job of explaining it. I don't know if it's because he doesn't actually make the logical argument, or if it's simply a matter of me not being able to understand his way of writing or the way it's been translated. What are your thoughts on what I see as being a major discrepancy? Do you think it's covered, or do you have any thoughts based on like everything else we've read so far?
Well, the descended soul is outside of the world soul, and it's certainly outside of the intelligible realm. So it's basically a soul that is enmeshed in matter. And so while it is enmeshed in matter, it's influenced and directed by matter insofar as the soul lacks free will. I think the greater the free will that you've developed, then the greater you can sort of direct your own future. But when it comes to why does the soul reincarnate in, for example, a lesser form, I kind of see that as momentum. I mean, I would avoid using Buddhist terminology, just to not conflate two very separate philosophies. But it is kind of like karma, where it's just a mechanistic process where the soul has sort of generated momentum toward a certain direction, and therefore that's the outcome that will happen. But it's not so much a taint or a sort of impurity that is festering in and then resulting in a future lifetime that could be infinitely worse than the present lifetime, but rather it's just momentum. I think it's just a case of mechanism. It's like a mechanistic, metaphysical reality.
But it's still therefore influenced by the life it lived, because the momentum we're talking about obviously isn't actual physical momentum of movement. It's some sort of allegory for some sort of metaphysical phenomena.
Right. Well, because the
so
soul,
it's somehow influenced by the body. Then so are you saying that earlier when he says that it's not that any sort of evil actions are not actually part of the soul? Do you think he's only talking of the higher soul and not the descendant soul? Okay.
The higher soul.
Because it's not very clear when he says that.
But again, it's not that the soul it's not like the vice or the evil is inherently a part of the soul. It's not like it's an organ of the soul. It's just that it's temporarily conjunct with it.
Okay.
But that can be removed. It's not like it's immutable, unchangeable. It is something that can be purified.
Okay.
But
It's almost like it's carrying the trauma of the action that can only be originated by the material passions
and the cravings and so forth for material things.
But the actual origin of evil can never be the soul, but that doesn't mean that it can't be in some way affected by what has happened.
And that's the challenge of the present lifetime, is that you have to divest yourself from vice, and vice is inherently connected with matter. And this would also connect with more subjective experiences we have in life, like falsity and lying. It's like, why do we lie? Well, normally, if you're lying, it's because you're either trying to gain something material or achieve some sort of social status, or to protect your person.
Or to protect others. We all lie all the time. Like we say micro lies all the time to maintain a social lubrication. Not everything needs to be said, because sometimes small lies are also to not hurt the feelings of another person when it's unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing you're talking about more malicious lying.
Malicious lying, falsity. So the more you indulge in the reason that we deceive people or we embrace falsity is normally because
manipulation.
And manipulation is in order to get ahead socially. But to get ahead socially is usually in order to gain something materially, even if it's like the material comforts and securities that come with having higher social status, that sort of thing.
Even one can make the argument that even like status or our perception of how we're seen socially is a material thing. It is a material thing. It's stroking our ego. It's stroking the lower part of some aspect of the brain. So like even things that are not like objects can still be material, right? Like fame without fortune. There's people who don't necessarily want to make a lot of money, but the mental illness tied around narcissism or egocentricity, I don't think these are things that are part of the intelligible realm. I think these are aspects of the material world, or things that can only exist in the material, even though they're not like tangible things.
Right. Well, fame is it's inherently connected with the material world.
Right. But I'm saying people do twisted things, sometimes not even to gain measurable, objective, or tangible things such as money or goods. They do it for these illusions of for the ego, which is, I think, one of the most salient illusions one can live. The separateness of the ego, of this idea of ourselves versus the true reality of who we truly are, the soul that is really part of everything. I think is one of the biggest illusions people can have. And fundamentally, the reason people want so much money and so much power beyond what they really could ever even spend or really need for comfort goes always back to this like need to feed this ego, this thing that pulls us ever more separate from the truth of our soul and the oneness of everything. That's my thoughts on that.
Right. So the ideal goal would be that you divest yourself from these vices, and that's when the soul actually is no longer subject to reincarnation, and that the soul ascends back up to the intelligible realm, and presumably there it stays, and you're no longer the descended soul has sort of run through its multi-life process, and then it's no longer subject to reincarnation, in which case that there's no allotted Daimon anymore.
Is that similar to the idea of a bodhisattva on some level, or is that different?
It's more similar to the idea of the arhat in early Buddhism, where basically the arhat has stopped reincarnation, rebirth altogether, and then when they pass away, it's parinirvana, and they're no longer reborn. Now the question afterwards is, what happens to their consciousness or whatever? Is it like just like like
I don't think you have consciousness even once you pass away. I don't think that
the permanent, irreversible unconsciousness. But then the Buddha didn't comment on that. So I mean, you can draw these sort of parallels. But I think in the Neoplatonic worldview, the intelligible realm is outside of time and space. So it's not like you're ceasing to exist for all eternity. It's just, and it's also that the material world is just a crude image or reflection of the intelligible forms anyways. So it's, in fact, you're basically just a return that's not even really a return, because this whole process in the material world was just a crude reflection of a higher reality to begin with. So in which case,
Right.
So in which case, if you what it's sort of hard to articulate in words to say that you return to the intelligible world, because it was always there and the world soul was always present as well. And it's just that when we're stuck in this cycle, lifetime after lifetime in the material world, it seems like this is actually the true reality, and that we're somehow going back to our origin, and then we'll just stay there for the rest of eternity. But eternity doesn't mean like endless time. It just means outside of time.
Right. It's concepts we can talk about, but we could never truly understand in our current form, because we're in this form. We're in a linear reality, and we're also talking about consciousness. I'm assuming, I mean, even the Buddhist concept, I don't see it necessarily meaning annihilation. Our and even in mythology or in the Ennead, he brings up the fact that, like, our ego, whatever you want to call it, our personality, our consciousness, once we pass away and there's transmigration of the soul doesn't hold on to that consciousness. I think our identity, as you see yourself as being yourself and I myself, these are just things that only exist in the material world, because they are part of the illusion. They're part of the illusion that we need to function as material animals.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I could see how an interpretation, even the Buddhist concept you brought up, doesn't mean annihilation of the self. It's a return to what the self is the self that isn't even a real thing. We're something else that can't really be perceived here.
The Buddhists vehemently deny the existence of a self, but the problem is that we have this belief very much ingrained in us, and a perception and an instinct towards selfhood. And so the challenge is
this
to
reality we do.
drop
I mean, I think you could interpret it right. I feel like Plotinus is saying something similar. I think the idea of the self, it's not like when you pass away, you're a ghost Jeff or whatever. Like,
right.
The vitality, that aspect which is part of the soul just returns, or doesn't even return. It just sheds the illusion of the self.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like you've always been looking at the same thing, and only after a while do you actually realize what you're looking at. You thought you were looking at something else, or you didn't see it at first. I feel like his concept of coming to true realization of reality is something like that, where sometimes you have things right in front of you and you don't see them. And then after a while you see them and you're like, oh, how did I not see that? Like on a cosmic level, though.
Right. I mean, fundamentally, there's the world soul. And so all of the descended souls, all of us, are coming from that world soul. But what does that, but at a basic everyday life level, I mean, it's hard to really imagine that or articulate that, because I feel so separate from everybody else. But that's the challenge of this, is to see or to experience that. And then I think the more you orient yourself towards that, then the calmer you'll be, and probably the more compassionate you'll be, because you'll see a world full of descended souls acting in very chaotic, self-serving, self-destructive ways, whereas fundamentally we're all basically coming from the same source. It's just it's just that we find ourselves in this material world, which is very, very difficult and challenging.
I think that's why all of these sages tell us to step away from vice, or stop acting on vice, because it's easier to let us know, oh, these things that you are aware of, they're not good. They're this, because we know what they are. They're things that we can conceive of. It's much easier to help us move away from what is bad than move toward what is good, that is like mind-blowing to us. And by at least moving away from what we can understand is bad, we are actually moving toward what is good. Because trying to get at it the other way around, I think is just so much harder for humans, right? To try to sit there and contemplate a reality that we're not maybe even fully equipped to conceive in this manifestation of ourself. Like trying to have a two-dimensional object be four-dimensional or three-dimensional. It's nearly an impossibility.
Right. And I think if we look at Stoicism, for example, the idea is that the Stoic sage who is free from the pathos, the passions, so basically vice, is just naturally compassionate, calm, helpful, unangered, unmoved. I mean, I think you could make the case in any culture that, the fewer internal struggles, anxieties, vices, cravings, and so forth you have, the natural human state is actually quite docile and helpful and compassionate. But when we're basically caught up with anger and anxiety and fear and paranoia, and cravings and so forth, we basically can commit all sorts of atrocities, or even just at a basic everyday life, we can do things that are very, detrimental to ourselves and other people.
Right.
And then that just sort of orients us towards worse conditions in the long term. And then in a post-mortem state, the momentum of that, according to Plotinus, will just direct the descended soul into an even worse state, potentially.
Right.
So that's the challenge, is like, it's not just live a good life, but it's also try to reduce all of these problems and all of these internal struggles that we have, and to, again, look upwards rather than downwards. And then it's a multi-life process, presumably. Maybe there's some people that they can manage this in one lifetime, but it seems to be a multi-life process, which again goes back to the Buddhist ideal that it's probably going to take a couple lifetimes, but some people can achieve awakening in one lifetime. But for most people, it takes several lifetimes.
I guess the other question, which he may have discussed in the past, or I guess Plato kind of discusses in his other books. My question is like, well, how did we, if we have all these lives that we're moving towards something, I don't think that we started in the crappy place we're at. Clearly, the first beings, the first souls that were embodied, they started getting worse. I guess that's the ancient concept of the golden age moving down toward the lower metals, of things kind of getting worse over time as we experienced multiple incarnations in the material world. Things just started getting, there's more predisposition for us to make bad decisions until we find ourselves in a bad place collectively.
Right.
Or a worse place anyways than we started off as.
In Buddhist cosmology, when the world, when the physical world first appears, it's just darkness. But you do have some beings, they're devas, they're beings of light. But then what happens is that they get a taste of the earth and it's very sweet. And then they become more and more, desirous of it. They crave it. And that as a result of that, they lose their luminosity, and then they turn into coarse bodies, material bodies. And then they're basically trapped in the cycle of craving material things, rather than being the original beings of light that weren't dependent on matter. I mean, there's that sort of idea in early Buddhist cosmology, where you do have a sort of downfall from a rather pristine state. And maybe we could say maybe it's something like that as well. But I guess if you look at it from this Platonic point of view too, probably if you're studying wisdom traditions, probably in a previous lifetime, maybe your most recent past life, you might have actually had an interest in this sort of thing and you studied it. So it sets you up for the present lifetime to have access to these sort of teachings, to be in a physical and mental state that you can actually read and learn about these things. So if it's a multi-life process, if you can't remember your past lives, and I certainly cannot remember my past lives, but then we can infer that maybe in your past life you were doing fairly well. So it's just a matter of building up on what you've achieved, and then hopefully either in this lifetime or the future lifetime you can really ascend into that into the intelligible realm.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that just because this chapter focuses on this idea of being allotted a fortune in life, he does not absolve us from having control of our life. We still have free will, and it's not really a judgment-based situation we find ourselves in. It's, as you said, a kind of a cause and effect, a metaphysical cause and effect of things caused by ourselves in a previous life, but that no matter where we end up, we can always choose to do better, and we have control over that. And it's not really a judgment-based philosophy. It's just matter of fact, this is how things work, and this is how you can get yourself to a better place.
Right. It's mechanistic. It's not that there's some divine being shaking a stick at you, or
the one does not have the sort of sentience of the Old Testament God.
It's also
that judge us that way.
It's also that when you pass away, it's not that you go before a judge who as a god maybe has been appointed with this role to judge your soul.
But you do end up in some waiting room where they look up what level you're at, and they find you the allotted demon, and he shows up. And
I think in ancient times, and possibly even today, I think those sort of similes, those sort of images are actually kind of helpful. You just don't take it literally.
Right. It's very nuanced forces, and and things happening that are beyond our conception. So we need to create little puppets to create shadows to even imagine these things.
Right.
Because we can't.
Like in the Egyptian model where your soul is weighed against a feather, and then that determines whether you get thrown into the crocodile or not. I think it's a crocodile or some sort of mythological animal. But I mean, you don't have to take that literally. You can take that metaphorically as well. And I think for, Greek philosophers, they would have seen these things as myths and not to be taken literally. And so they always had this sort of like larger, refined metaphysical interpretation of these myths, but they didn't reject them. It's just that it's an image, it's a metaphor, a simile.
Right. You need words to conceive of things.
Right. So, but going back to your point, yeah, so what this means is that you can be given, or you could find yourself in very challenging circumstances that are completely outside your control, but how you react to them is up to you. And that's the lesson to take away. So you can either make your situation a lot worse. Like, for example, you could, I don't know, find yourself in very difficult life circumstances. And then like you turn to, for example, alcohol or drugs. And then you just end up making your situation far worse as a result of that. Or you can exercise your free will and try to,
right.
become
and I think
a better person.
The other lesson that I think Plotinus is trying to bring up to people is people often will say, oh, why has a God, or why has fortune put me in this place? It doesn't make sense. I don't deserve it. Nothing makes sense. He's bringing light to wherever you're at is because you've put yourself there. He's not judging you for it. He's just saying there is a reason for things, and the reason is you.
And it's also your personal proclivities too.
Right.
I mean, what you do on a day-to-day basis forms who you become. I mean,
Right.
at this higher multi-life process, then you can say that your previous lifetimes have shaped who you are in the present lifetime.
Yes.
But what that means is that you have the potential to make your future lifetime even worse than the present one. So you should probably rectify whatever sort of problems you have in the here and now.
Right.
And I mean, even if we dismiss all of that as unfounded religious ideas, and even if, for just hypothetically, for instance, we don't want to believe in any of that, but then even if you just look at that worldview and you were to cultivate it, your life is probably going to be better off in the long term because you'll try to cultivate healthy relationships with people, avoid lying and deception, and avoid all sorts of intoxicants and all sorts of cravings and these sort of things, and you'll live a life directed towards a greater spiritual goal. And I think just the outcome of that will just be a better lifetime for you and the people around you.
I think it also at least orients people away from what I think, and I think Freudians thought was a very childlike mentality towards reality, which is the judging Godfather figure, where because one could say, why should I be good in this life? When we die, nothing happens to anybody, or the same thing happens to everyone, and therefore people may choose to not be good. But also the idea of you have to be good or you will be judged and you will be punished is not really a psychologically or spiritually great way to live your life either. What he's presenting is whether or not you actually believe that this is what happens, but at least orienting yourself to a kind of mentality where it's about becoming a better person, not just for this life, but so that you will be a good person. Because if you think nothing's going to happen afterwards, it could just be bad. But also to orient yourself basically toward truth, that truth is the end goal, because to truly know who you yourself truly are, that you are the soul, and to return to the soul is in essence to return to the most fundamental truth and beauty that exists. So it's a very philosophical way of living, to always orient yourself toward truth. That truth itself is the goal, and you can reach that through control of the self, through compassion and knowledge and good choices.
Well, it's also that the more you orient yourself and achieve truth, the fewer pathos you have, the fewer passions and problems you have. And so the outcome of that will just be that you have a lifetime where you're calmer and you're just generally living a better, more agreeable life. And so
people who are not there don't get that. You see what I mean? For some people, teachers who are trying to get people on the right road, you need to give them something that will even get them started, because you have to have at least started to even appreciate some of these things, right? Because some people don't even truly believe that they can ever be good. I think that's a problem a lot of people have. People think that everything's going to be wrong for them because they think they're fundamentally worthless or bad. That goes back to psychology, but I think that's a big part of why people don't think they can control their pathos or their passions or their addictions or just their toxic behaviors with others or putting themselves in bad relationship or whatever it is. Because deep down, they don't think that that they have the power.
Right. And I mean, maybe there is a certain determinism in this as
Right.
well, where there's just some people in their present lifetimes will just not have the ability to pull themselves away from, material addictions and toxic behaviors and so forth. And I mean, from a teleological point of view, you could say, well, maybe that's just part of the design of reality, is that some people just have to go through those experiences. And even if you try to convince them otherwise,
but there's another life, they will be different at some point.
Hope. I mean, that's the hope. That's the hope. But going back to this idea of when you die, nothing happens, and it's just permanent, irreversible unconsciousness for the rest of eternity.
Well, it's annihilation. It's not even unconsciousness.
Right.
It's pure annihilation.
It's pure annihilation. It's like you delete yourself or you go offline forever. And everybody will face the same outcome. In which case, then I think you can make the argument for hedonism, just like, well, you should just enjoy your material existence as best you can, and
I think that's why we live in the society we live in.
Yeah, I mean, most people are pursuing, hedonistic. I don't say most people, but a lot of people pursue hedonistic desires. I mean, it's sex, it's food, it's social status, it's all
ultimately,
the sort of
though, it doesn't
ties.
make them happy. And ultimately, I think most people, at least, either attempt to change or remain very unhappy because it's not true human nature. It's not. Humans are actually, I think, they're capable of terrible things, but I think our true nature, the nature that we are most comfortable in, is one that is a much more benign one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the Stoics say the same thing, is that a person without the pathos is very, very compassionate and at ease. And I would generally say that's the case in my experience, dealing with different people from different religious backgrounds, people who are genuinely at ease with themselves, and they've presumably overcome a lot of their own, personal vices and problems and so forth. They generally are just nice people, quote unquote nice people. I mean, that doesn't really characterize them properly, but it's more that they're, compassionate, at ease, helpful. They're not vindictive. They're not.
They're healthy humans, is what they're describing.
They're healthy humans. Because it's just it's in our human nature. If we don't have fear and anxiety and paranoia and trauma informing all of our decisions, that we're just generally compassionate, receptive people.
And also that we have meaning, because the reason for a lot of people have no meaning, and it's easy to just fall into materialism. I think having meaning is also a very human thing. It is it's one of the marking the underlying definitions of humanity, of humans, is that our self-awareness of our existence and trying to struggle with what that means. It is our nature to want to have meaning, and meaninglessness can't bring anything good for us.
What I've seen in recent years too is that there's a lot of people who are basically arguing from a materialist point of view, but they're like, well, we need to look at evolutionary psychology and somehow recreate in the modern day the conditions, as close as we can, the family and social conditions of our Neolithic ancestors, because we assume that they didn't have the same sort of anxiety and grief that we have today. So
there's different ones.
There's constantly people saying like, well, we need to go back to having a village, because it takes a village to raise a child, as they say. We have to live in close communities, and we have to have all these healthy human relationships, and there's an argument that we've lost these. And I'm not so convinced about that, because I know people who live in small cities and so forth, and they're always within close distance to relatives and friends who they've known their whole lives.
But it's not really the same. Well, now we're falling into a completely different discussion about the structure of modern society, is really what we're talking about. They're still living in a what's the term that Durkheim used? I don't remember. But they're not in a mechanical society anymore. I think a lot of it is, there's more to this idea of a smaller group than there is what you're saying. I'm not saying that being in a smaller group is going to resolve everything. I think there are some aspects, some socioeconomic aspects that might be resolved if people had wider families. I was just reading the other day that I guess in the US, the Surgeon General says now that it's bad for your health to be a parent. I'm like, okay, well, is it bad for your health to be a parent? Or is it that people who are parents now live in a society that has created an economic situation and a social expectation that is very different than anything that's actually sustainable, such as one in which both parents have to work, if there even are two parents, that there's certain expectations of what in this relationship to the child where there's an obsession with the child and their whole identity is wrapped around the child, or the complete opposite where they are very negligent. And also the fact that people no longer have, for the most part, do not have their kin helping them raise children, which has been a factor in humanity pre-industrial age, I think most places. And things like that, I think, would help a lot of the problems we have, which create undue stressors. I'm not saying that recreating some of that would resolve everything, but I think it would. I think a lot of our stressors and some aspects of alienation are tied to the structures we have now. But obviously people were in different situations and eventually became more fucked up anyways, right? Because here we are.
Right. I mean, there's so many factors with the mental health epidemic. I mean, everything you outlined, I think, is completely accurate.
But maybe it's that with a marriage of things, right? Man in his earliest incarnation maybe had some things right, but didn't have the wisdom that we have now. We've gone through a lot, so we are much more wise. If we were able to, just kind of like when you're older, you look at young people and you're like, oh, if I only knew to appreciate some aspects of my youth that I didn't at the time because I was young and had no experience. Maybe man in his earlier social dynamics clearly took for granted some good aspects they had because we were in the childhood of our species. If that makes sense.
It's also that it's like in an idyllic state, then you're not really faced with challenges, and without challenges, you don't grow.
Right. Well, they had challenges. They were just different challenges.
They were different challenges, yeah. So, but I mean, this kind of brings to mind the idea of like, well, why is it that the material world isn't idyllic? Why isn't that we don't have a Garden of Eden, that we find ourselves in these terrible circumstances as embodied beings? And I mean,
I feel like you discussed that already.
You did. And so, but basically it's that this is basically evil arises out of matter fundamentally, but it's not an error of creation. It's actually
part of it. Is what it is.
It's out of necessity. It's out of necessity. It's not
right.
A bug.
There's no bad and good in the way that we kind of grow up thinking of these things.
Yeah. It's not like there's some sort of agent. There's not some sort of agency that's, causing this. It's out of necessity. Well, on that note, then I think we can wrap up.
Yeah. Well, we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks.
Yep. And our next episode will be on love. So thanks everybody for listening. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.